Welcome to the AZ Political Podcast. I'm Jim Sharpe. Our headlines this week. Headline number one, State Senate President Warren Peterson introduced a bill called the Make Arizona Election Results Faster, which shockingly aims to make Arizona election results faster, like on election night. It contains some of the things that Senator Peterson told us about on the AZ Political Podcast just a few weeks ago, like requiring that the last day you can drop off a mail-in ballot would be on the Friday before Election Day. And based on how the post office has been operating lately, and the fact that the postmaster literally, like putting his hands over his ears, doesn't want to hear any criticism about it, it might be a good idea to just walk all of your mail-in ballots in the future to a polling place. Headline number two, after speculation that President-elect Donald Trump would nominate former Fox TV anchor and two-time losing Arizona Republican candidate Kari Lake to be ambassador to Mexico, it did not work out that way. He head fakes and instead picks a former CIA guy, a guy who served as Trump's Salvadoran ambassador before, Ronald Johnson. And Trump then nominated Lake to be director of Voice of America, the U.S. government's foreign broadcasting service. Chuck Todd told me earlier today that he's a little worried that Lake won't like the job because it won't mean any on-camera time for her. And headline number three, Trump is scheduled to speak at Turning Point USA's America Fest event in Phoenix next week. America Fest is scheduled for Thursday, December 19th through Sunday, December 22nd at the Phoenix Convention Center, but it's unclear which day Trump will speak. But speaking of Trump, joining me on the AZ Political Podcast is presidential historian Dr. Brooks D. Simpson. He's professor of history at Arizona State University, and Dr. Simpson is the author of more than a dozen books, a number of which deal with the Civil War era and Reconstruction. Professor Simpson, thanks for joining us.
Glad to be here, Jim.
Yeah, I'm always impressed by anybody that writes one book. I'm like, whew, okay. And I would love to sometime talk about Civil War history in Arizona, which, really consisted of one kind of skirmish. But, there's a lot of interesting history there. But I wanted to talk about presidential politics with an Arizona focus. But first, I kind of wanted to take the 30,000-foot view, if that's all right, of how historical the last, 8-10 years have been, going from Barack Obama, a two-term, relatively moderate Democrat, to a populist Republican in Donald Trump, to Joe Biden, someone we thought was a moderate Democrat who by his own choice only serves one term and then back to Trump. Whew, when was the last time that we actually saw a president serve one term and one term only as his choice? Because Lyndon Johnson didn't actually serve only one term.
Right. In terms of only one choice termers, we're going to go back to the 19th century, people like James K. Polk, Rutherford B. Hayes, all these household names in the American political consciousness. But usually people have wanted to run again. The last person who really said, I don't want to run again, Calvin Coolidge, back in 1928. And even he had 1.5 terms because he had succeeded to the presidency upon the death of Warren G. Harding in 1923. So you have a lot of people who wanted to run multiple terms. And even in the case of President Biden, I'm sure the temptation was still there, but he was, shall we say, dissuaded. Yeah.
When I say he decided to not run again, that decision may have been made elsewhere, and he just kind of, all right, I'll go along with it. One of those deals. But this is definitely very historical. You got one president serving one term. He loses to the guy who has the next term, and then he ends up back in the presidency. You and I talked about this on the radio. That hasn't happened since, the 1890s in Grover Cleveland.
Grover Cleveland, who won in 1884, lost in 1888, and then won again in 1892, and soon had cause to regret that.
Yeah, why was that?
A major economic crash in 1893.
Yeah, and interestingly, I think that's why a lot of people who didn't vote for Trump in 2020 ended up voting for him in 2024 because of economic reasons.
Yes, how, they experience everyday life and price at the pump or price at the grocery store for a dozen eggs or a gallon of milk. They saw prices going up. That meant to them that times were bad. And so they turned to the person who said that they would bring back the good old times.
Arizona has a rich history when it comes to presidential politics. Barry Goldwater in 1964, John McCain in 2008, both of them unfortunately losing, I guess. Has it surprised you to watch, and I don't mean to make light of it at all, but watch Arizona's mood swing, from Trump to Biden back to Trump?
It's not all that surprising. I mean, one of the things that has happened in Arizona has been the issue of immigration and border issues, and those have become more and more important to the average Arizonan. So there's all this talk about Arizona becoming a purple state and starting to lean demographically towards the Democratic Party. But the fact is that things aren't quite as simple as some people said they would be, and it's interesting how Republicans really staked a claim to parts of the state. Now, we still elected a Democratic senator, Ruben Gallego, and so it shows that it's not all one way. It's not one big red wave. But perhaps in the Gallego case, it didn't hurt that his opponent was somebody who, shall we say, was controversial.
Yeah, absolutely. And Arizona, I think a lot of people just imagine, since its inception in 1912, it's just been a Republican state. It was really pretty much run by Democrats for a long time, but they were a different kind of Democrat than today's Democrat. Is that right?
I would say that in Arizona, if you are a moderate Democrat, you still have substantial chance to fare well in politics. A truly liberal Democrat, somebody who would be defined as a leftist, that person would not have quite the same chances. But I do think, and Republican conservatives are different too. Barry Goldwater was really a libertarian, so he did not follow along with a lot of the social issues that many Republicans embrace.
A lot of people have suggested that Barry Goldwater lit the fuse that Ronald Reagan exploded eventually, that was the start of what would become that form of conservatism for many, many years to come. Do you agree with that?
I do agree with that. That after all, Reagan made a speech for Goldwater on television during the 1964 campaign, and one of the things that people didn't fully comprehend yet was the impact of the civil rights and voting rights legislation in the 1960s, while it mobilized an electorate of African Americans to vote Democratic. It also created a reaction to that, and many people, especially in the Southeast, the former Confederacy, who had been lifelong Democrats, all of a sudden found themselves as Republicans. And so the party of Lincoln had become the party of something else by the 1970s and 80s. And Reagan embraced that.
I actually, it's funny, I ran into Barry Goldwater Jr. a few weeks ago, and he actually remembered who I was. He actually had come over to my home studio and had recorded a commercial back when I was working in politics. And I told him, I said, I became an elk about 2 years ago. And I said, I became an elk because your dad belonged to the lodge that I joined. And he's like, yeah, I remember him being a Shriner. I remember him being an eagle. I don't remember him being an elk. But, Goldwater really was the lifeblood of the Republican Party here for so long, even after he lost the presidential bid in 1964. So while there was a different kind of Democrat that did really well in Arizona in the form of a moderate Democrat, and the folks like Carl Hayden and all that, we have a different form of Republican in Arizona now, too, don't we?
Absolutely. I mean, Goldwater, I met Goldwater in the 1990s, last decade of his life. He came to Arizona State to speak at my class at my invitation.
Wow!
And
how cool was that? I got to ask. I got to ask one of those Farley questions. How cool was that?
Well, first of all, I have to say that. Former senator used language that would have gotten me in trouble with the university administration had I uttered those words. But he was very candid about his likes and dislikes. He liked John Kennedy. He didn't like Lyndon Johnson. But he also didn't like Richard Nixon at all.
Yeah. He was one of the guys that went up and convinced him to resign.
He didn't care about gays in the military, but he did care about women in the military. So he was an individual, true and true. And so, to a large extent, was John McCain. And so there was this, what McCain would have himself called a maverick streak to his republicanism. And I think if you were outside Arizona, you sort of scratched your head and wondered what was really going on here. We've gone from maverick individuals to some individuals who are prominent in American politics, or at least in state and local politics, who are Republicans. And there's some head scratching about what they say and how they handle themselves. So I still think that the state is trying to find its way, as it always has, and blazed its own trail, and that's how you can get a Ruben Gallego, that's how you can get a Mark Kelly. So we're represented by Democrats. So that's also you can get a Kristen Sinema, who clearly became a celebrity on the national stage, not always because of what she did, but what she wore or what she said. Right. And she's an unusual individual. Let's just put it that way.
Yeah. So I guess Arizona is, what we can count on with Arizona is that you're not going to get the normal blank anything.
No, because, I mean, at this point, we've got a Democratic governor, 2 Democratic senators, which, yet at the same time, Trump carried the state rather comfortably this time compared to his struggles here in 2020.
Do you, being a history professor, especially, focusing on presidential history, do you think that gives you any insight into the future? or have you just through the years said, you know what, I have no idea based on what's happened so far, what's going to happen next, and that's based on what I've seen happen time after time after time?
Experience teaches you that it doesn't always repeat itself. That is that great humorist Mark Twain put it, sometimes history rhymes. And so you can detect patterns, but there are some people who've claimed they have predictive abilities in this regard, and they were wrong this time. And I don't think it's so much my job to predict, but to say, but look for this and see what happens when this happens. So there's more, let's say, prepared sensibility to what might happen, which is why I think a lot of people who comment on American politics from my neck of the woods often inject their personal preferences as to what they want to see happen. Mm-hmm. I believe my job is to call it like it is, for at least as I see it, and whether that cooperates with what I might feel personally, that's not important. What's important is you get straight talk from me on what I think is going on.
No, I appreciate that. I really do, Dr. Simpson. And but based on who's out there right now, and based on history doing this and that and the other thing with the parties, who's going to rise to the top, or who has the potential to rise to the top to make the next run for president out of the Democrats? And then should we just go, well, it's going to be J.D. Vance for the Republicans in 2028?
I think you see Gavin Newsom positioning himself as a possible presidential candidate. I also think Buttigieg is going to think about this as well. Mm-hmm. There may be somebody who emerges, though, who is young at this point, who in 4 years will be in position. That was the situation with Barack Obama, 2004, right. Brand new to the United States Senate, and then 4 years later running for president. So there are people that can come out of the woods. But I do think one of the things that has happened, and I think it's a good thing for the Democratic Party, is I think they have waved goodbye to a certain generation of leadership that they were basically addicted to. And that, I think, explains the Biden candidacy in 2020. There were other possibilities, but Biden was the safe and sure possibility. He was that man at the moment. But even then, we thought, well, this is, as he himself put it, a transitional presidency. It just was a faster transition than he had anticipated.
Right. A one-term transition. Mm-hmm. And based on what you've seen in the past in Arizona, too, what is the future history of presidential politics in Arizona? Or is that, once again, because we're so mavericky, impossible to even come close to pinning down?
Well, the interesting thing to me is that if there are actually solutions that people accept maybe even embrace, but I guess accept when it comes to issues of immigration and the border. You take that issue away from Republicans. Solving an issue takes it away from you.
Yeah.
And then you have to come up with something else. And it's not clear, and you can already see this with the Trump administration, what the president-elect is saying. We're going to bring grocery prices down. Now, he's admitted in the last 24 hours that it's a little more difficult to do that than you think. There are a lot of promises that were made, a lot of bright people with a lot of big egos in the room, some very controversial, so they even get in the room in the first place.
Yeah.
I think that the Trump administration is going to find a lot more obstacles to achieving what it wants to achieve. And I will think they will find, just like many other presidential administrations, that they've overpromised.
I hope you'll accept. I didn't really just throw this out there. I hope you'll think about joining me again, because I would love to talk about the history of the Arizona Territory during the Civil War, how it actually ended up being a Confederate state, but that was based on, a smaller battle than usually happens on a football field every Sunday. And
there are more reenactors who show up for that battle than there were actual participants.
Picacho Peak, by the way. I do know that much. That would be fascinating. Dr. Simpson, appreciate your time and really appreciate your perspective, the historical perspective of what an odd kind of 10 years we've been through here across the nation and in Arizona.
It's been a strange ride.
All right. Thank you for watching the AZ Political Podcast. I'm Jim Sharpe. We'll see you soon.
Thanks for watching the AZ Political Podcast with Jim Sharpe. Click the box to watch more from KTAR News and tap the button in the middle to subscribe.